was supposed to be a quiet evening. Margaret Lane, a soft-spoken woman in her early 70s, had mustered the courage to visit Maison d'Or, a high-end French restaurant nestled in the heart of San Francisco. Wrapped in her well-worn beige coat and a floral scarf she'd owned for decades, she walked through the golden-lit doors with quiet hope. She wasn't looking for luxury or spectacle, just a warm meal, a candlelit table, and a small way to mark another year of life. She hadn't made a reservation. Tuesday evenings were usually quiet, and she figured they might find a table for a woman dining alone. But before she could even take another step inside, a sharp voice cut through the air like cold steel. "Ma'am, this isn't that kind of place," snapped Lucien, the maitre d', his tone dripping with disdain. He eyed her from head to toe, taking in the scuffed shoes, the handmade purse, the silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, as if her very presence insulted the restaurant's polished aesthetic. A few diners turned to look, their chatter fading into an uncomfortable silence. Margaret froze, her cheeks flushed. She clutched her purse a little tighter, heart sinking. Lucien stepped closer, his voice raised just enough for everyone to hear. "We have standards here," he said curtly. "You can't just walk in off the street looking like that." The words stung, more than she cared to admit. Margaret had never asked for much. She'd spent her life working hard, raising children, sewing costumes for local theaters, and getting by with quiet grit. She wasn't rich, but she wasn't lost either. She was proud of her life, of who she was. But in this moment, surrounded by chandeliers and whispers, all she felt was small. She tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. All she wanted was dinner. All she got was judgment. The restaurant didn't fall silent. It recoiled. Conversations slowed, forks paused mid-air, and glances darted toward the woman by the door like spectators drawn to an unfolding spectacle. Margaret Lane stood there, the warmth from outside now fading fast from her cheeks, replaced by a cold rush of embarrassment. She felt exposed under the crystal chandeliers, her sensible coat now seemingly more out of place than ever. Lucien, the maitre d', stood rigid before her, his arms crossed like a security gate. He didn't lower his voice. In fact, he made sure it carried. "We don't cater to walk-ins," he said with a dry laugh. "Especially not ones who show up looking like they just left the clearance rack at a thrift store." The words hit harder than they should have, not because Margaret hadn't heard worse, but because of how easily he discarded her humanity. His contempt wasn't just policy, it was personal. And the crowd? They didn't laugh, but they didn't stop him either. A couple in tailored suits exchanged whispers behind wine glasses. A woman in a pearl necklace gave Margaret a once-over and looked away, unimpressed. These weren't strangers. These were bystanders. Margaret straightened her back ever so slightly, instinctively pulling her coat tighter. She didn't want charity, didn't want drama. She just wanted dignity. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's my birthday, I thought maybe—" But Lucien cut her off with a wave of his manicured hand. "Save it," he scoffed. "This isn't a soup kitchen." And just like that, the humiliation was complete. But Margaret didn't cry. Not here. Not in front of the man who took pride in making her feel invisible. She had lived through tougher moments, raising 2 children alone in a 1-bedroom apartment, working night shifts while learning to mend costumes by lamplight. She had weathered life's harder storms, but that didn't mean this didn't hurt. As she turned slightly, unsure whether to leave or hold her ground, a quiet fire stirred within her. She wasn't a nobody. She was someone's mother. She was someone with a story. But nobody in that room, none of the polished faces or pristine uniforms, seemed to care. All they saw was a coat. All she wanted was to feel like she belonged, just for one night. Instead, she stood under a spotlight of silent judgment. At the far end of the restaurant, near the bar where the lighting was dim and the air smelled faintly of cedar and citrus, a man in a black leather jacket sat nursing a glass of water. He had arrived early, hoping to surprise his mother for her birthday. He hadn't told her he was in town. He wanted the moment to be quiet, intimate, special. But what he witnessed instead twisted something deep inside his chest. The woman being humiliated in front of a room full of strangers, treated like a nuisance, was his mother. That same woman had once gone without meals so he could eat, worked back-breaking shifts sewing clothes and costumes, and never once complained. That woman was Margaret Lane, and he was her son, Keanu Reeves. He didn't make a scene. Not yet. Keanu wasn't the type to shout across a room or throw punches just because he could, but the stillness in his body said more than rage ever could. His jaw clenched, his hand tightened around the glass. The smirk on Lucien's face, the way he waved her off like she was disposable, it struck a nerve no red carpet or camera flash could ever desensitize. She had no idea he was watching. Her eyes stayed down, her voice trembled, but she stood her ground. That quiet dignity, that unwillingness to crumble, was exactly why Keanu admired her more than any award he'd ever won. He stood. The movement was subtle, but the energy in the room shifted instantly. Patrons who had looked away now looked again, squinting, whispering. Some recognized him, others simply sensed the authority in his presence. He removed his sunglasses slowly, letting his hair fall loose from his beanie, and began walking toward her. "Mom," he said, softly but clearly, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife through velvet. Margaret turned, startled, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Keanu?" she whispered, her voice carrying a mix of shock, relief, and something close to dread. Not because she wasn't happy to see him, but because she didn't want him to witness this. Not this. Lucien froze, the color drained from his face as recognition set in. "Sir, I didn't realize," he stammered, already backpedaling. "I didn't know she was with you." Keanu stepped between his mother and the man, towering yet calm, and said with quiet steel, "She's not with me. She doesn't need to be. She matters because she's a person. That should have been enough." The room went still. You could have heard a fork drop. Margaret lightly tugged on her son's sleeve, pleading gently, "Keanu, please, don't make a fuss. I'm okay." But he turned to her with warm eyes and said, "You're not okay, Mom, and I'm not letting this go." He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Every word was soaked in love, in protection, in the quiet fury of a son watching his mother's dignity trampled on. And for the first time that night, Margaret wasn't standing alone. The silence in Maison d'Or was absolute, like a held breath waiting to be released. Lucien, the maître d', stood frozen, his bravado crumbling beneath the weight of recognition. The name, the face, the presence, it all hit him at once. Keanu Reeves wasn't just another customer, he was a global icon. But more than that, in this moment, he was a son. A son staring him down with the kind of quiet authority that couldn't be taught in any leadership seminar or hospitality training. Lucien opened his mouth to explain, but the words got caught somewhere between panic and pride. "If I'd known she was with you," he began, but Keanu cut him off with a gaze so sharp it felt like truth being unsheathed. "She doesn't need to be with anyone to be worthy of kindness," Keanu said, his voice low, steady, and unshakable. "You judged her before you even asked her name. You insulted her because of how she looks, not because of who she is." A ripple of discomfort passed through the dining room. Some guests now looked away, embarrassed. A few nodded subtly. A woman in a red dress whispered to her husband, "He's right." The man who had smirked earlier now stared at his plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Lucien looked around for support and found none. Keanu turned to his mother, who was clutching her purse with one hand, the other gently resting on his arm. "Let's just go," Margaret said softly, her voice calm but resolute. "I don't want to stay where I'm not welcome." Keanu hesitated. This wasn't just about dinner anymore. It was about dignity. It was about standing up not only for his mother, but for every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or diminished for not fitting someone else's version of enough. He looked at Lucien again, then slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. The call was brief, quiet. "Yeah, it's me. Let's go ahead and finalize it. Within 24 hours. He hung up, returned the phone to his pocket, and then looked at Lucien with a calmness that felt like a storm holding back. "I just bought this place," he said. "As of tomorrow, you no longer work here." Gasps rippled through the room like the breaking of a dam. Lucian stumbled back a step, face pale, mouth agape. You can't just—" "I can," Keanu interrupted, "and I just did." He turned to the young waitress Lily, who had tried to help his mother earlier despite the risk. "What's your name?" he asked. She blinked, startled. "Lily," she whispered. "You want to run this place?" he asked, gently but directly. Lucian laughed, a hollow, panicked sound. "Run it, her! She's been here a week!" Keanu didn't flinch. "Then she has 1 week more experience treating people with kindness than you ever had." Turning back to Lily, he said, "You're the new manager, starting now." Lily's tray wobbled in her hands. "Are you serious?" Keanu nodded, dead serious. Lucien stood there, helpless, a man who had built his authority on shallow appearances, now watching it all dissolve in the face of true character. And yet the biggest moment hadn't come. Margaret stepped forward. Her voice, though aged, carried strength born of decades. "Keanu," she said, "I don't want a restaurant. I don't need revenge. I just wanted dinner and dignity. That's all." He looked at her, quietly listening. "If you want to honor me," she said, her gaze sweeping the room, "don't give this place to me. Change it. Make it into somewhere people are treated like people." The room was silent. Keanu nodded slowly. "We'll do it your way, Mom." And with that, the power shifted, not just from one man to another, but from ego to empathy. 1 week later, Maison d'Or no longer looked like the fortress of exclusion it once was. The chandeliers still sparkled overhead, the marble floor still gleamed beneath polished shoes and muddy boots alike, but something in the air had shifted. Gone was the rigid tension, the icy stares, the whispers of judgment. In its place was warmth, laughter, the clinking of glasses raised in celebration, not social competition. The new Maison d'Or was still elegant, but its heart had changed, because its soul had changed, and that soul belonged in many ways to Margaret Lane. That Friday evening she sat near the front window at a small corner table, the golden city lights of San Francisco casting a soft glow over the chocolate cake placed gently before her. A single candle flickered at its center. The belated birthday celebration was modest by any external measure, but to Margaret it felt like a miracle. Keanu sat across from her, his jacket draped over the back of the chair, a quiet smile playing on his lips as he watched the room, not as a celebrity, but as a son. Around them, the restaurant buzzed with a new kind of energy. At one table, a college student in a hoodie laughed with a grandmother in pearls. A construction worker in dusty jeans clinked mugs with a young couple celebrating an anniversary. No one asked about reservations. No one cared about clothes. The only real standard was kindness. Lily, now the new manager, moved between tables with a kind of radiant focus. She still looked a little stunned by everything that had happened, but her eyes held purpose. She greeted every customer like they belonged, because now they did. The menu had changed too. The fine French cuisine remained, but a chalkboard near the door now offered daily community specials. Warm, affordable meals priced for accessibility, not prestige. And somehow, the food tasted better, because dignity, it turned out, had flavor. Keanu leaned forward, his voice low and full of affection. "You didn't want ownership. You didn't want a name on the door. You just wanted a place that felt human again." Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening. "Because that's what matters," she said softly. "All my life I was told I didn't quite fit. I was too poor, too plain, too quiet. But I raised my kids right, and I never let the world harden me. That should count for something." "It does," Keanu said. "You taught me that." She reached across the table and cut him a slice of the cake, her hand steadier now, her shoulders lighter. Around them, conversation swirled. A man in a worn army jacket raised his glass to her from across the room. A teenage girl snapped a photo of the chalkboard menu saying, "I wish more places were like this." 2 artists sketched on napkins by the bar, smiling. This wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a community, diverse, imperfect, alive. Patrons had begun to call it Margaret's Place, even though her name wasn't on the sign. not because she owned it, but because she'd transformed it. She had turned a night of humiliation into a legacy of grace. Where once there had been gatekeeping and shame, now there was warmth and welcome. Her quiet resistance, the way she stood tall when it would have been easier to walk out, had started something bigger than any birthday celebration. And Keanu? He had given her the gift she didn't even know she needed. Not a restaurant, not revenge, but a place where her values could live and breathe, a space where kindness was policy, and no one would ever be made to feel small just for showing up. Margaret looked around, her heart full. "You know," she said, "I think this is the best birthday I've ever had." Keanu chuckled softly, the sound rich with emotion. "Took me long enough to get it right." And as the candle flickered down and the room echoed with joy, they sat side by side, not as a Hollywood icon and his humble mother, but as two people who'd reminded an entire room that kindness is power. Not loud, not flashy, but strong enough to change everything. Maison d'Or had become more than a restaurant. It was a symbol, not just of reinvention, but of quiet revolution. In a city known for fast money, status, and image, here stood a place where people mattered more than appearances. And at the heart of it all was Margaret Lane, the woman who never asked for recognition, but ended up inspiring transformation far beyond the walls of a dining room. She didn't seek headlines. There were no press releases or grand openings. But word spread, first through whispers, then through stories shared between neighbors, co-workers, and friends. "Did you hear what happened at Maison d'Or?" became a question people asked not out of gossip, but awe. The story of the old woman who stood her ground and the son who stood beside her began to echo, not just because it featured a famous name, but because it was deeply, profoundly human. What had started as a night of humiliation had turned into a movement, not driven by anger, but by empathy. The staff learned to look beyond attire or bank accounts and instead see people. The single father taking his daughter out for pancakes, the elderly woman celebrating her retirement, the artist paying with coins and dreams. They were all welcome now. Margaret never took credit. When people thanked her, she simply smiled and said, "Kindness is free, we just forgot how to use it." And in that quiet humility, she became a beacon. Keanu didn't buy a building that night. He helped restore a sense of humanity in a city that too often rushed past it. And as he watched his mother laugh at a table, surrounded by strangers who had become family, he realized she had always been the real star. Maison d'Or became a place people returned to not just for the food, but to feel seen. It was living proof that a single act of courage, anchored in compassion, could send ripples through an entire community. And so, Margaret's legacy lived on, not in gold letters on a menu, but in every plate served with respect, every door held open, and every soul reminded that they, too, belong. The story of Margaret Lane and her son Keanu Reeves reminds us of a powerful truth at the heart of American values. Every person deserves respect, regardless of how they look, where they come from, or what they wear. In a society often obsessed with appearances and status, we're reminded that real worth lies not in wealth or prestige, but in how we treat one another. Margaret didn't raise her voice, demand attention, or seek revenge. She stood in quiet strength, anchored by dignity. And Keanu, with compassion and conviction, stood beside her not just as a son, but as a man unwilling to let injustice go unanswered. Together, they transformed a moment of humiliation into a legacy of kindness. The lesson is simple but profound. Never underestimate the impact of empathy, and never forget the humanity in others. Whether you're a waitress, a stranger at the next table, or someone with influence, you have the power to make someone feel seen. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change a life. In a world that moves fast, this story invites us to slow down, pay attention, and lead with heart.